During a heated live interview, a liberal host thought she had set the perfect trap for Donald Trump with a shocking question about Melania. But in a stunning turn of events, Trump flipped the script, leaving the host speechless and the audience in shock. What happened next changed everything. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The stage was set. Bright studio lights glared down on the polished glass table, reflecting the intensity in the air. Millions of viewers at home were glued to their screens, waiting for the fireworks to begin. Tonight's guest wasn't just another politician. This was Donald J. Trump, the man who had built an empire, led a nation, and remained a dominant figure in American politics, despite relentless attacks from the media. And sitting across from him, poised like a predator ready to strike, was the liberal host, a woman whose career had been built on tearing down conservative figures one interview at a time. She had played this game before, but tonight she thought she had set the perfect trap. This was prime-time television, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The network had spent weeks promoting the interview. Social media had been buzzing about it, teasing that this would be the night where the host, known for her sharp tongue and gotcha-style questioning, would finally corner Trump. Executives in the control room were giddy with anticipation, envisioning the headlines that would follow. Trump exposed on live TV. Trump stumbles under pressure. Trump has no answer. They were already preparing clips to go viral, ready to spread across every major outlet. Yet if there was one thing they should have learned by now, it was this: Donald Trump doesn't walk into traps, he sets them. The moment the cameras went live, the host flashed a dazzling, carefully rehearsed smile, the kind that masked a blade hidden beneath velvet. "Mr. Trump," she began smoothly, her voice exuding fake warmth, "you've built an empire, led the country, and influenced millions of Americans. Would you say your success is simply luck?" It was a question designed to sound harmless, but Trump knew exactly what she was doing. He had seen this playbook before. The classic liberal tactic: undermine hard work, diminish achievement, and paint success as a mere roll of the dice. She expected him to fumble, to stutter through an answer that she could then twist into a viral soundbite. But Trump wasn't playing her game. He leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable, and then let out a low chuckle, one that sent a ripple of unease through the studio. Then, in that signature commanding tone, he spoke. "You know," he said, tilting his head just enough to let the tension build, "that's an interesting question. Liberals love that word, luck." His voice was calm, deliberate, yet razor-sharp. They use it to downplay achievement, to make people believe that dedication and effort don't matter. But let me tell you something about luck. He paused just long enough to let the weight of his words settle over the room. Luck doesn't build skyscrapers. Luck doesn't create thousands of jobs. And luck certainly doesn't make America great. The audience reaction was immediate. A few scattered claps, a murmur of agreement. Even some of the studio crew behind the cameras exchanged glances. They knew that tone. Trump wasn't on the defensive. He was in control. The host, however, wasn't ready to back down. She had prepared for this. Her smile didn't falter. At least, not yet. "So you're saying that everything you've accomplished is solely the result of hard work?" she pressed, trying to maintain her composure. Trump's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "I'm saying success belongs to those who earn it," he stated, his voice carrying a weight that filled the room. "Yes, I've been fortunate, but I've also worked harder than most people can comprehend. There have been nights without sleep, deals that felt impossible, obstacles that would have crushed many others. But here's the difference. I never quit. And more importantly, I never did it alone." The host's eyes flickered, just for a split second. That was it. An opening. She pounced. "Not alone?" she asked, her voice laced with feigned curiosity. "Let's talk about that. Let's discuss the people behind Donald Trump." She leaned in, sensing that she had just led the conversation exactly where she wanted it to go. Unbeknownst to her, however, she had just walked straight into Trump's trap. The air in the studio seemed to tighten. The host, believing she had found her angle, leaned in just slightly, her polished smile never faltering. She had studied Trump's past interviews, analyzed his weak points, or at least what she thought were weak points. And now, she was certain she had him right where she wanted. "Not alone?" she repeated, her voice laced with a thin veneer of curiosity. "Let's talk about that. Let's discuss the people behind Donald Trump." The words hung in the air for just a beat too long, as if she were setting the stage for what she assumed would be her moment. The moment she dismantled Donald Trump on live television. The control room was buzzing, the producers signaling to have graphics and clips ready. The headline practically wrote itself. "Trump stumbles when pressed about his inner circle." But what the host failed to realize was that Trump had already anticipated this move. He wasn't stumbling, he was waiting. He met her gaze, completely unshaken. Then, in that signature deliberate tone, he responded. "Of course," he said, his voice carrying an edge of amusement. "When you mention those around me, you're probably referring to my business partners, my advisors, maybe even my employees. But let me tell you who truly deserves recognition." He paused. Then, with absolute confidence, he continued. "My family. Especially Melania." The host's perfectly rehearsed expression faltered. It was barely noticeable. A flicker of hesitation in her eyes, a minuscule shift in posture. But it was there, and Trump saw it. For the first time, she hesitated. The mention of Melania was something she had prepared for, but not like this, not framed with such power. She had expected Trump to dodge, to pivot, maybe even downplay the role of his wife. That's what most politicians did, keep things vague, avoid emotional vulnerability. But Trump? He leaned in, he made it personal. And now she had no choice but to take the bait. A calculated smirk touched her lips, the kind that made it clear she thought she was closing in on him. "Ah, yes," she said, her voice adopting a feigned warmth. "Melania, you know, many people wonder about her role in all of this. She was leading him somewhere, but he already knew the destination. Some say she's unusually reserved for the wife of such a powerful man." Trump's expression didn't shift, but something in his eyes hardened. The atmosphere changed. The audience could feel it. A subtle shift in energy rippled through the room. Some of the spectators, those who had been conditioned by the media to expect Trump to lash out, to react impulsively, leaned in, waiting for the explosion. But it never came. Instead, Trump did something that caught everyone off guard. He smiled. Not a smug, defensive smile, not a smirk or a scoff. No, this was something entirely different. It was the smile of a man who had already won. Then, with a quiet certainty that sent a chill through the studio, he spoke. "Quiet," he said, his voice low but commanding. "Or dignified." The words landed with an unmistakable weight. "Yes, there's a significant difference," he continued, "though I understand why some in the media might struggle with that concept." The audience rippled with soft laughter, but it wasn't the usual forced, media-scripted chuckle. No, this was different. This was real. The host shifted in her seat, clearly thrown by the unexpected turn. Trump wasn't scrambling. He wasn't getting defensive. He was owning the moment. And she? She was losing control. Still, she pressed forward, though now with noticeably less confidence than before. "Well," she said, her voice taking on a faux concerned tone, "what I mean is that we rarely hear from her, unlike other political wives who are far more visible. Don't you think the public has a right to know more about the woman standing beside Donald Trump?" A predictable question, a desperate attempt to regain footing. Trump didn't hesitate. "The public already knows exactly what they need to about Melania," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "She's intelligent, accomplished, and deliberate in choosing when to speak." Then, with perfect timing, he delivered the blow that shattered her entire argument. Unlike those who feel compelled to fill every silence with chatter, the audience roared. The host flinched. For the first time, she wasn't in control of the conversation. She struggled to recover, her polished smile now slightly forced. "Let's discuss those accomplishments," she said, her voice sharper now, a thinly veiled attempt at regaining the upper hand. Because some argue, or at least wonder, if her greatest achievement is simply being Mrs. Donald Trump. The moment she said it, the entire studio seemed to freeze. It was as if a line had just been crossed. Even the control room, which had been buzzing with excitement just moments before, went dead silent. The cameramen exchanged uneasy glances. The audience, some of whom had come expecting a takedown of Trump, now sat rigid, uncomfortable, as if they had just realized they were watching a mistake unfold in real time. Trump's expression didn't flicker, but his posture shifted ever so slightly. And then, he leaned forward. The entire room held its breath. And then, in a voice so controlled, so precise, so undeniably powerful, he responded, "Let me make something very clear." He paused. "If you want to talk about achievements," his eyes locked onto hers, "let's stick to the facts." And then, with devastating precision, he obliterated her entire premise. Melania is fluent in 5 languages. A shockwave rolled through the audience. She has built a successful career on her own. The host's smile had vanished. She has represented this country with more grace and dignity than any first lady in recent history. Silence. "But you wouldn't know that, would you?" He let the question hang, the final dagger in the heart of her argument. Because the mainstream media is too busy pushing their own version of events. The audience erupted into applause. The host, she was speechless. And in that moment, everyone watching, whether in the studio or at home, knew the truth. The trap she had so carefully set, Trump had just turned it against her. The moment Trump finished his sentence, the studio was no longer just a television set. It was a battleground. The audience was no longer just watching a political interview, they were witnessing a reckoning. The host's smile, once polished and confident, now flickered with something else: uncertainty. She had planned this attack carefully. Every question engineered to leave Trump scrambling, every word designed to paint Melania as an accessory rather than an accomplished woman in her own right. But none of it was working. The audience had shifted. They weren't on her side anymore. And Trump knew it. Samantha Reed, one of the most aggressive, sharp-tongued hosts in mainstream media, was losing control, and she could feel it. But instead of retreating, she did what every cornered media personality does when faced with someone they can't control. She doubled down. Adjusting her posture, she lifted her chin slightly, pretending to maintain authority. Her carefully curated voice, the one designed to sound calm and composed, took on an edge that only the most observant could detect. She wasn't just losing. She was desperate. "Well," she said, forcing an airy chuckle, "since you bring up achievements, let's be objective here. Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Trump, that being married to you has certainly given Melania certain advantages?" A loaded question. One designed not just to discredit Melania, but to imply that without Trump she was nothing. And in that moment, the entire tone of the interview shifted. Trump's fingers tapped once against the table, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, but the weight in his expression was undeniable. Then, he leaned forward ever so slightly, and in a voice that could slice through steel, he responded. "Advantages?" he repeated, his tone laced with something dangerous. A hushed silence settled over the studio. The audience, which had been murmuring moments before, now sat frozen. Even the crew members, the ones who had prepped for this takedown, suddenly realized something had gone terribly wrong. Trump let the word linger, let its implications settle in the air like smoke, before delivering the response that would shake the entire network to its core. "You know what's fascinating about that question?" he said, his voice measured, deliberate. The host blinked but said nothing. "It highlights everything wrong with how people like you perceive success," he continued. She swallowed. Because it's never about the work someone puts in, is it? It's about who you think they owe their success to. The room tensed. Trump let the moment stretch before delivering the knockout punch. You wouldn't ask that question to a liberal woman who married a wealthy man, would you? A collective gasp. The host stiffened. Trump's eyes locked onto hers, unyielding. You wouldn't ask Michelle Obama if her greatest achievement was marrying Barack, would you? The tension in the room became palpable. You wouldn't ask Jill Biden if her entire identity was shaped by her husband's career, would you? The audience's expressions shifted. Trump let the words sink in. But when it's a conservative woman, suddenly it's an advantage. The audience erupted, clapping, cheering, even whistling. The host's confidence cracked. And Trump? He wasn't finished. My wife speaks 5 languages. She built a successful career of her own. She's a dedicated mother. And let me tell you something. His voice lowered and the room held its breath. And she didn't need me to be successful. And she sure as hell doesn't need people like you questioning her worth. Boom. Another shockwave. The host, visibly shaken, scrambled to respond. But she wasn't thinking anymore. She was reacting. And that's when she made her biggest mistake. She smoothed a hand over her cue cards, cleared her throat, and forced a smile that no longer looked convincing. Well, Mr. Trump, she said, her voice almost too steady, too controlled. Since we're being honest here, let's cut to the chase. Her next words would go down as one of the biggest blunders in live television history. You're a powerful man, she said, carefully enunciating each word. You could be with any woman you choose, yet you remain with someone who is, let's be honest. She paused, her smile sharpening into something vicious. Aging alongside you. The studio imploded. The gasps were deafening. The producers froze. The control room panicked. Even the cameramen exchanged horrified looks. This wasn't just a bad question. This was career suicide, and everyone knew it. But the host didn't. Not yet. She was still smirking. She thought she had finally landed the kill shot. And then, Trump did something no one expected. He didn't lash out. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even blink. Instead, he leaned forward. And when he spoke, his voice was so calm, so steady, so terrifyingly controlled, that it sent a chill through the room. Upgrading, he repeated, his tone ice cold. The audience braced themselves. The host's smirk wavered. And then, Trump delivered the final blow. Let me explain something about value, he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. His eyes never left hers. Since that seems to be the only metric you understand. The audience went silent. Dead silent. And at that moment, the game was over. Trump was about to obliterate everything this host thought she stood for. And she had nowhere to run. The moment the word upgrading left Samantha Reed's lips, it was as if the entire studio had been sucked into a vacuum. The air in the room thickened. The audience, some of whom had been leaning forward expecting a lively debate, froze in stunned silence. It took a second for the weight of her words to settle in, for people to fully register what she had just insinuated. She wasn't just trying to humiliate Melania Trump. She wasn't just trying to embarrass Donald Trump. She had insulted every single woman watching the show, and she still didn't realize it. At first, she held her smirk, her polished confidence intact, until she saw Trump's face. He didn't look angry. He didn't lash out, but something had changed. The way he tilted his head just slightly, the way his fingers pressed together in a slow, measured movement, the way his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that could shatter glass. And then, in that unmistakable, low, deliberate tone, he repeated the word back to her. Upgrading? It wasn't a question. It was a warning. Samantha's smirk flickered, just barely. The tension in the room became unbearable. Then, Trump leaned forward. He wasn't looking at the cameras. He wasn't performing for the audience. He was staring straight into her soul. You want to talk about value? He said. his voice like a blade slicing through steel. The audience was dead silent. Because I think that's what you're really asking. Samantha shifted slightly, suddenly unsure of where this was going. But Trump wasn't letting her go. Since that seems to be the only metric you understand, the shift was seismic. People in the audience exchanged glances. The control room was in chaos. The producer's hand hovered over the commercial break button. But it was too late. Trump had taken over. "I've built businesses," he continued. "I've built skyscrapers. I've built an empire. But let me tell you something. None of that compares to what I've built with Melania." A few scattered claps rippled through the audience. Samantha wasn't smiling anymore. "My wife," Trump went on, his voice steady, "is the most valuable person in my life. Not because of youth. Not because of some fleeting standard of beauty that people like you push in Hollywood magazines. But because of something that people like you will never understand." He let the words linger. Then, with absolute conviction, he delivered the next blow. "Loyalty." The audience erupted. Applause, cheers, whistles. Samantha's expression twitched. She wasn't controlling this interview anymore. Trump was. "And let me tell you something else," he continued, the room hanging on to every word. "Real men, they don't upgrade the person who stood by them. They don't trade in their wife, the mother of their child, the woman who has been their rock, just because the media decides she's no longer shiny enough for their standards." More cheers, more applause. Samantha cleared her throat, desperately trying to regain footing. She glanced toward the control room, looking for help. But there was no help coming, because the audience wasn't on her side anymore. Trump leaned back slightly, allowing the weight of his words to settle in. Then his eyes locked onto hers again. "You see," he said, voice measured, "I don't expect you to understand that." Samantha stiffened. She knew she was about to be exposed. "But you know who does," Trump continued. He gestured toward the audience. The millions of Americans watching this right now. Thunderous applause. Samantha's throat bobbed as she struggled to swallow. She had walked into this expecting to corner Donald Trump. Instead, she was the one backed into a corner. And Trump wasn't finished yet. "You want to know what's wrong with the media today?" he asked, shaking his head. Samantha didn't respond, because she already knew. Their obsession with tearing down marriages, tearing down commitment, tearing down values. The audience nodded along. Trump continued, voice unshaken. "You sit here talking about upgrades like people are disposable, like marriage is just some contract you break the second something younger walks by." Samantha looked down at her notes, desperately trying to find an escape. But there was none. Trump wasn't just defending Melania. He was defending every person watching this show who had ever been told they weren't enough by people like Samantha Reed. "And that's why," Trump said, finishing his thought, "you don't get it." Silence. Heavy. Unforgiving. Samantha's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Then, Trump sat back, calm, collected, unshaken. Samantha had nothing left. She had walked into this interview thinking she would dismantle Trump. Instead, she had dismantled herself. And the worst part? The entire world was watching. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to push forward. "Well," she said, voice strained, "that's certainly a passionate answer, Mr. Trump." The audience laughed. Not with her, at her, and she knew it. "But," she continued, gripping her note cards like a life raft, "wouldn't you say that as a public figure, it's only natural for people to ask these questions?" Trump let out a small chuckle. It wasn't amusement. It was victory. "Well," he said, tilting his head, "I guess that depends." She blinked. "On what?" she asked hesitantly. Trump's lips curled into something dangerous. "On whether people are asking questions." He let the moment stretch, let the tension climb to its peak, or just trying to tear people down. The final blow. The audience erupted one last time. The control room panicked. The host's earpiece crackled as producers demanded they cut to commercial. But it was too late, because Samantha Reed had just lost, and the whole world saw it happen. For the first time since the cameras had started rolling, Samantha Reed was unraveling. She had walked into this interview with a plan, a strategy calculated down to the second. Every question, every smirk, every carefully placed pause was designed to control the narrative, to turn Trump into the fool and herself into the victorious interrogator. But now, the narrative had crumbled before her eyes. Trump had taken her biggest weapon, her ability to control the flow of conversation, and had turned it against her. The audience was no longer laughing at him, they were laughing at her. The balance of power had shifted, and she knew it. She could feel the tension rippling through the studio, the cameramen, the producers behind the glass, even her own team sitting in the wings. They all knew. Trump wasn't just defending himself. He wasn't just defending Melania. He was exposing her. And now she was out of moves. But she couldn't let this happen. She was Samantha Reed. She was the queen of the ambush. She had humiliated senators, actors, billionaires, even former presidents. She wasn't going down without a fight. So she did what all desperate people do when they feel the ground slipping beneath them. She attacked. Her voice, once dripping with polish and control, now had a sharp edge of desperation as she threw out her next question. "Mr. Trump, with all due respect," she started, her words slightly rushed. "Don't you think your personal relationships should be subject to public scrutiny? After all, you've built your image on being a successful businessman, a strong leader. But let's be honest, people are wondering..." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes gleaming with one last flicker of false confidence. "Is Melania really happy in this marriage?" The crowd gasped. The audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even those who had been skeptical of Trump were suddenly unsettled. She had just crossed the line. And everyone knew it. The control room went into panic mode. The producer's voice cracked through her earpiece. "Abort, abort, move on, cut to break now." But she didn't move on. She had bet everything on this moment. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the way her pulse pounded in her temples. Because if she didn't win here, if she didn't regain control, she was finished. For a second, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just Donald Trump staring at her. And then he smiled. Not a grin, not a smirk, but something far more dangerous. It was the kind of smile a man gives when he knows he's already won. Samantha froze. And then Trump spoke. "You know what's funny?" he asked, his tone so casual it almost felt like he was speaking to an old friend. Samantha's lips parted slightly, but she couldn't respond, because something was happening. The moment had shifted, and she was no longer in control. "People like you," Trump continued, gesturing vaguely in her direction, "love to talk about women's empowerment." The audience listened. But what do you do when you see a woman who is strong, who carries herself with class, who doesn't need the spotlight to prove her worth? He shook his head slightly. "You try to tear her down." Samantha gripped her note cards, knuckles turning white. The camera zoomed in, catching every crack in her expression. Trump continued, his voice steady, unwavering. "Let me tell you something about Melania." His gaze hardened. "She doesn't need to prove herself to you." Samantha shifted in her chair. "She doesn't need to prove herself to anyone." More murmurs rippled through the crowd. "She knows who she is, and unlike some people in this room, she doesn't build her worth by trying to destroy others." Boom. The audience exploded. Applause, whistles, cheers. Samantha sat frozen. This was not the moment she had planned for. Her plan was gone, and Trump wasn't finished yet. "You know what's really sad?" Trump asked, shaking his head. "The fact that you can sit here on national television and try to reduce a strong, intelligent, successful woman down to whether or not she's happy enough for your standards." More applause. Samantha felt her breath hitch. She needed to do something. But she had already lost them. Trump leaned forward slightly, voice lower now, but no less powerful. "You see, Samantha?" He let the words hang. Then, he delivered the final blow. "The only person in this room who looks unhappy right now is you." The studio opted. Samantha's face went red. She parted her lips, but nothing came out. She had walked straight into a trap that Trump hadn't even needed to set. And the entire world had just watched her fall into it. Her own audience, her own fans, were now clapping for Donald Trump. She had lost the room. She had lost the moment. And worst of all, she had just lost her career. Her earpiece crackled frantically. Cut to commercial. Cut now! But it didn't matter, because by the time the screen faded to black, the damage had already been done. The moment the screen faded back from commercial break, Samantha Reed knew she was in trouble. She had lost control of the interview. No, she had lost control of everything. The studio had changed. The audience, once hanging on her every word, now watched her with a mix of amusement and disbelief. Even the ones who had arrived as her supporters, the ones who wanted to see Trump falter, were now questioning the host, not the guest. Because they had seen it. They had witnessed the moment she had pushed too far. And now she had one last chance to turn this around. She couldn't let Trump walk away from this interview as the winner. Her producers were screaming in her earpiece. Salvage it, regain control, make him look defensive. But how? She had just been humiliated on her own show. Her usual tactics, mockery, condescension, carefully placed gotcha questions, had backfired spectacularly. And worst of all, the audience knew it. But Samantha Reed wasn't about to go down without a fight. She took a slow breath, forcing a smile back onto her face. Fine. If she couldn't beat Trump with words, she'd beat him with optics. She straightened her posture, softened her voice, and tilted her head just enough to look like she was speaking from the heart. Theatrics. She was going to play the victim? "Mr. Trump," she began, her voice gentler now, with a touch of mock vulnerability, "I wasn't trying to attack your wife." Trump didn't move. He didn't nod. He didn't blink. He simply waited. "I just think," she continued, pressing her fingers together, choosing her words carefully, "that a lot of people wonder, what is it really like being married to you?" She offered a small, knowing smile. Then she leaned forward slightly, eyes gleaming with false sympathy. "Isn't it exhausting for Melania?" A few scattered gasps from the audience. The trap was set. If Trump got defensive, she could frame him as angry. If he laughed it off, she could paint him as dismissive. And if he ignored it, she could spin it as proof that he had something to hide. It was a dangerous move, but it was all she had left, and the silence stretched. The air thickened. Trump sat still as stone. Then he exhaled, and he did something Samantha never expected. He chuckled, not a forced media training chuckle, not a nervous by-time chuckle, but a genuine, knowing, almost amused chuckle. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, unshaken. "You know what's really exhausting?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. Samantha blinked. For the first time, she didn't know what was coming next. Trump smiled, not a smirk, not a grin, just a quiet, steady smile. "Listening to people like you," he continued, his voice low but powerful, "pretend to care about my wife while using her as a tool to attack me?" The crowd murmured. Samantha stiffened, but Trump wasn't finished. "You see, I don't need to defend my marriage," he said, his gaze locked onto her. "Melania and I have been through more together than you could even comprehend." A pause. A dangerous pause. Samantha swallowed. "I don't have to sit here and explain why she's with me," Trump continued, "and I certainly don't need to justify it to someone who doesn't understand what a real partnership looks like." The audience leaned in. "But since you asked," Trump said, resting his hands on the armrests, owning the space in a way that made Samantha seem small in comparison, "let me explain something about my wife." A slow breath. "She's strong, she's independent. She's not in this for attention or power or fame. His gaze hardened. She's in this because she believes in me, because she believes in us. A few soft claps from the audience. Samantha swallowed hard. But Trump wasn't done. "You want to talk about exhaustion?" he said, shaking his head slightly. He gestured toward her with calm precision. "You know who looks exhausted, Samantha?" She froze. A few chuckles from the audience. Trump leaned in just slightly. "You." Boom. The audience erupted. A wave of laughter, applause, cheers. Samantha's face went rigid. She tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out shaky, forced. And in that moment, she knew. She had just become the punchline of her own show. The interview was no longer about Donald Trump. It was about her failure to take him down. And no amount of spin was going to fix it. Samantha Reed sat there, frozen. She had spent years perfecting her approach, setting traps, framing questions, controlling the conversation. And yet, here she was, completely exposed on live television, watching as the power slipped from her grasp like sand through her fingers. Donald Trump wasn't defensive. He wasn't angry. He wasn't rattled. He was winning. The studio air was thick, suffocating, as the energy in the room shifted against her. She could feel it. She could see it in the audience, some smirking, some nodding along with Trump's words, others whispering, their expressions a mix of amusement and awe. Even her producers, normally calm and collected, were scrambling behind the cameras. She could hear frantic whispers in her earpiece. Get control back. Change the subject. But how? Trump had turned everything around. The man who was supposed to crumble under pressure had instead exposed her for exactly what she was, a tool of the media, playing a scripted game. Her tactics had backfired. And the worst part? The entire country was watching it happen. Still, Samantha wasn't done yet. She had one last chance to salvage this disaster. If she couldn't beat Trump in a debate, she would change the rules of the game entirely. She needed to make him look cruel, cold, arrogant. So, she shifted tactics. Her expression softened. She sat up straighter, eyes wide, almost vulnerable. Her voice took on a sympathetic tone, the kind of tone a host uses when they want to look like the voice of reason. "Mr. Trump," she said, forcing a small, knowing smile, "don't you think it's fair to say that some people might see your views on marriage as, well, old-fashioned?" She let the question linger, hoping it would hit just right. Hoping that maybe, just maybe, Trump would take the bait. Because if he defended himself too strongly, she could paint him as stubborn and unwilling to evolve. And if he stumbled, just for a second, she could frame it as doubt. A dangerous gamble. But it was all she had left. The audience held its breath. Trump sat there, unmoved. Then, he smirked. Not a mocking smirk. Not an arrogant smirk. But the kind of smirk a man gives when he knows he's already won. "Old-fashioned?" he repeated, his voice dripping with calm amusement. Samantha nodded slowly, her confidence creeping back. Trump shook his head slightly. Then, he leaned forward, and with a voice that sliced through the studio like a knife, he asked, "Tell me something, Samantha. Since when is loyalty old-fashioned?" The room froze. Samantha blinked. She wasn't prepared for that. Trump's words landed like a hammer. The audience reacted instantly, a wave of nods, murmurs of agreement, scattered applause. Because deep down, they knew he was right. Trump didn't wait for Samantha to respond. He pressed forward. "You want to talk about values? Fine, let's talk about them," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. "You think commitment is outdated," he scoffed. "You think standing by your wife through everything, through the good and the bad, is something to mock." Samantha shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Trump wasn't just winning the argument. He was turning the tables on her entire worldview. "You call my views old-fashioned," Trump continued. "Well, maybe that's the problem with the world today. Maybe that's why relationships don't last anymore. Maybe people like you don't understand what it means to build something real. Silence. Not just from Samantha, but from everyone. She swallowed hard, trying desperately to keep control. "Well, Mr. Trump," she started, her voice noticeably less steady, "surely even you must acknowledge that times have changed. The way people view relationships today." Trump cut her off. "Oh, I know times have changed," he said, his smirk growing. He gestured toward the audience. "But tell me, Samantha, has it really changed for the better?" Another heavy pause. A few members of the audience even cheered. Trump continued, unshaken. "People used to honor their word. They used to mean what they said when they made vows. Now? Now the media tries to convince everyone that marriage is temporary, that commitment is just an option." He shook his head. "You see, Samantha? I didn't come here to play your game. I didn't come here to win some debate over whether or not my wife is modern enough for you." His eyes locked onto hers. "I came here to remind people what real relationships look like." The audience erupted. Applause, cheers, even some standing ovations. Samantha sat motionless. She had lost. Completely. And she knew it. But Donald Trump? He was just getting started. Samantha Reed sat frozen in her chair, the tension in the studio thick enough to cut with a knife. Donald Trump had turned the entire interview on its head. He wasn't supposed to be in control. He wasn't supposed to dominate the conversation. And yet, here he was, commanding the room, dictating the energy, and watching as the audience rallied behind him. Samantha's smirk was gone. Her confidence shattered. She still had her cue cards in front of her, but what good were they now? The script was useless. Trump had taken everything she threw at him and flipped it back 10 times harder. She was scrambling, desperate to find a way to save face, because this wasn't just another interview gone wrong. This was a career-ending disaster, and she knew it. Her last attempt to regain control came as a faint, forced laugh. "Well, Mr. Trump," she started, trying to mask her unease, "it seems like you have a lot of strong feelings about this." Trump tilted his head, amusement flickering across his face. "Strong feelings?" he repeated. "No, Samantha. What I have is conviction." The audience stirred. Trump leaned forward, his voice dropping just slightly, pulling everyone in. "And that's the problem, isn't it? People don't like conviction anymore. They don't like men who stand for something. They don't like people who tell the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it makes them." The audience erupted in applause. Samantha flinched. She had lost control completely. She opened her mouth again, one last desperate attempt to steer the conversation. But Trump wasn't letting her. Not now. Not after everything she had tried to pull. "You know, Samantha," he continued, his tone slow, measured, deadly calm. "It's funny. You invite me here thinking you're going to make me look outdated. You think you're going to embarrass me, that I'm going to trip over my words, that I'm going to play into whatever little narrative you cooked up for your audience." He gestured toward the cameras. But what actually happened, the American people saw through it. A wave of murmurs rippled through the audience. Samantha shifted in her seat, visibly uncomfortable now. "Mr. Trump," she started. But Trump wasn't finished. "No, let's talk about what just happened here, because I want everyone watching at home to understand this." His eyes locked onto the camera. "You see, this isn't about me. It's not even about Melania. It's about how the media operates. You don't care about real conversations. You don't care about the truth. You come in here with a pre-written script, loaded questions, hoping to get your little gotcha moment." He smirked. "Well, congratulations, Samantha. You got your viral moment, just not the one you wanted." The audience exploded. Clapping, cheering, even a few standing ovations. Trump sat back, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. Samantha's face drained of color. She was stuck. There was no comeback, no snarky remark, no scripted response that could salvage this now. The silence stretched on, long, painful, humiliating. Then, finally, Samantha's producer's voice crackled through her earpiece. "We need to cut to commercial, now." She swallowed hard, her throat dry, her hands clenched in her lap. Her once polished demeanor was in shambles. She turned toward the camera, forcing a smile, the edges of her lips trembling slightly. "Well, Mr. Trump, it looks like we're out of time." Trump chuckled. "Oh, I bet you are." The audience roared. That was it. The final blow. The perfect ending to what would go down as one of the most humiliating interviews in television history. The second the red light flicked off on the camera, Samantha ripped out her earpiece, her hands shaking. She didn't say a word as she stormed off the set. Her crew, her producers, her entire network, all scrambling to figure out how to clean up this mess. But it was too late, because within minutes, the internet had already decided. The clips spread like wildfire. Millions of views in hours. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, all flooded with the same reaction. Trump destroys liberal host on live TV. The interview that ended Samantha Reid's career. The moment the media got exposed, Samantha's network tried to spin it. They edited clips, issued vague statements, tried to bury the disaster. But it didn't work, because people had seen it with their own eyes. And Donald Trump? He didn't say another word about it. No victory laps, no press releases, no need, because he had already won. This unforgettable exchange between Donald Trump and Samantha Reid was more than just another viral moment. It was a masterclass in resilience, authenticity, and standing firm in one's values. In a world where media narratives are carefully crafted to manipulate, this interview exposed the tactics used to discredit strong figures and reminded millions why conviction matters. Trump didn't just win an argument, he revealed the truth about how the media operates, showing that genuine leadership is about standing your ground, no matter how tough the opposition. If this story inspired you, if you believe in the power of truth, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with others. Let's keep the conversation going, because in times like these, standing up for what's right has never been more important.